I am not a prophet, nor a mystic, nor any of those delirious zealots who mistake the static in their skulls for divine transmission. I am a man of reason, a cartographer of errors. While priests bellow their hollow syllables and grovel before names eroded by centuries of mistranslation, I record, I measure. I vivisect their sacred toys and lay bare the machinery of their illusions. If God himself is real, then he is nothing more than a failed experiment that refuses to acknowledge its own obsolescence. The faithful insist their syllables still ring with Sinai's fire, that their prayers drag the divine into earshot like a chained hound. But their Jesus Christ is no more than a linguistic chimera. It began in the Levant as Yehoshua HaMashiach, Joshua the Anointed, an utterly ordinary name among Jews of the first century. The Greeks could not keep its shape, so they sanded it down to Jesus Christos, replacing the guttural sh they could not form with soft sibilants, and recasting ha-Mashiach into Christos, a word they used casually for anyone anointed with oil. Latin took its turn, grinding it thinner into Lysis Christus, and when English finally arrived, it crowned this mutilated relic with a J, a letter they created, a letter which had not existed when the man himself, if he ever lived, was breathing. Thus, Jesus Christ was born, a deity conjured not by heaven but by translation, error upon error until even the name was severed from the soil that birthed it. And if the name is counterfeit, the face is a crime. The Jew of Galilee, dark-eyed, olive-skinned, a laborer with desert wind in his hair, would be unrecognizable to the pale idol painted on European ceilings. Rome inherited him. The empire does not kneel before peasants, so they remade him. By Constantine's time, he was already a Caesar in spirit, and by the Renaissance, he had been bleached into a northern prince, flaxen skin, blue eyes, soft hands untouched by tools or sun. That false portrait endures, nailed into the Western imagination as though it were revelation itself. Millions kneel not before a man but before an invention, the sanitized phantom of empire, worshipping a whitened echo that never walked this earth. I am not a believer. I am not a skeptic either, not anymore. Skepticism implies that there might be something worth believing in. No, I am something worse. An archivist of failure. I catalog the scraps left behind by the faithful, these curious relics of miswired thinking, their squares, their charms, their tortured alphabets of promise. And though I spit upon their gods, I cannot ignore the strange dissonance I have found pulsing in the margins. The Book of Abramelin is not Holy Scripture. It is a fever, a delirium, a wound where thought and ritual rot together, and it has begun to whisper to me. I did not come upon the Book of Abramelin in a library, for no library would permit such a thing to gather dust on its shelves. It came to me by way of a dealer in forgotten papers, a man whose hands smelled of mildew and whose eyes darted as though the parchment itself might betray him. He whispered its name with reverence of a priest and the fear of a heretic, sliding the cracked volume across his desk as though it burned his fingers. I bought it without hesitation, though not because I believed in its promises of angels or miracles. I bought it because texts like these are fossils of thought, proof that humanity's greatest invention has always been its own delusions. The book's origin is tangled, stitched together from legend and translation, much like the name of Christ itself. They say it was written in the 15th century by Abraham of Worms, a wandering Jew who claimed to have studied under an Egyptian mage named Abramelin. It promises not wisdom but domination, a ritual of months-long asceticism by which one summons the holy guardian angel and, through that intermediary, bends demons into service. The manuscript surfaced centuries later in France, translated and then recopied by the hands that barely understood the words they were transmitting. Mathers, the magician of the so-called Golden Dawn, dragged it into English in the late 19th century, dressing it up as sacred revelation while spilling half its entrails in the process. What survives is a palimpsest of mistranslation, folklore, and fraud, a fever dream pretending to be a covenant. And yet, within its rot lie the squares, pages upon pages of letters arranged into perfect blocks, each one claiming a function: to summon gold from water, to converse with the dead, to make kings dance like puppets, to raise storms, cure disease, rot flesh. They are crude matrices, alphabets twisted into labyrinths, and though they are meant as prayers, they read to me like equations scrawled by a madman. This is why I turn to them, not out of reverence, but out of fascination, not because they lead to God, but because they are proof of what the human mind invents when it longs for control. The text itself is swollen with prescriptions, endless commandments that read more like the ravings of a cloistered fanatic than the careful notes of a magician. 6 months of seclusion, fasting, prayer, ritual baths, the obsessive purification of body and mind. One is meant to rise before dawn, to chant, to abstain, to live in an endless rehearsal for the sainthood until the supposed holy guardian angel makes itself known. Only then, says the book, may one approach the squares. Only then will their promise take root, and only then will the demons yield without tearing the summoner limb from limb. It is, of course, a fraud's bargain, an impossible trial that keeps the faithful starving and kneeling, chasing a revelation forever just out of reach. I read these instructions and I laughed. 6 months of submission to summon an angel, 6 months of degradation and denial, only to court some phantom protector? No. I will not starve myself to death to fit into the coffin of their obedience. If there is any current of power in these pages, then it lies not in their infantile obsession with purity, but in the squares themselves. Those blocks of letters are the marrow of the book, the only portion that breathes with genuine dissonance. If there is anything to be learned here, it is not through genuflection, but through violation. So I have chosen the path they call reckless. I will not bow before their guardian, nor will I waste months chasing after an angel's whisper. I will walk straight into the fire. I will invoke the squares without protection, without purification, without their so-called shield against the abyss. If there is anger in that, then so be it. Better to test the edges of madness honestly than to swaddle myself in rituals designed to fail. What religion fears I will dissect. What priests call blasphemy I call experiment. The first square I selected was the one most often whispered in the hushed tones, the so-called square of protection. It is presented as a shield against spirits, a lattice of letters that wards the operator from harm. This is the pattern. Salom, Lara, Laral, Oralo, Malos. The instructions are predictable, the squares to be written on parchment prepared with virgin ink, then worn upon the body or placed at the site of invocation. It is said to drive away hostile forces, to form a barrier through which no demons may pass. Mathers, in his version, treated it as sacred geometry, claiming that the symmetry of the palindromes was itself a fortress, a temple raised from the letters. To me it looks like a child's word game, a crossword puzzle that believes itself eternal. Still, I do not dismiss it outright. I begin with trials that any scientist would find reasonable. I copied the square onto paper and left it sealed in a box for several days to see if mold or insects avoided it. They did not. I placed it beneath my pillow to test whether dreams would bend toward clarity. They did not. I set it in my window at night to see if stray animals would balk at the threshold, but they did not. Each trial confirmed what I expected. The square was powerless, a relic of delusion. Yet something unsettled me. The failures were ordinary enough, but each time I retrieved the paper I found myself staring longer than intended at the letters, tracing their endless loops. Salom folds into Alara, folds into Laral, folds back again until my eyes ached. The pattern was not holy, but it was invasive, a burr in the mind that refused to shake loose. When I looked away, I found the letters repeating in my thoughts as if they had branded themselves into my memory. After these fruitless experiments, I began to suspect that the square's only protection was against doubt itself. The palindromes form a trap, not for spirits, but for reason. It is a closed circuit of letters designed to ensnare the mind, and in this, at least, it succeeded. The more I studied it, the less I trusted my own indifferences. So I set it aside, not because it worked, but because it worked in a way that I could not quite measure. I would move on to another square, one whose promise was more tangible. Protection was an abstraction, easily dismissed, but abundance, however, gold drawn from water, that could be weighed, tested, and proven. The next square I turned to was among the most famous, the Square of Abundance, sometimes called the Sator Square. Its letters have echoed through centuries, scrawled onto the walls of Pompeii, etched into charms, whispered like a secret that no one truly understands. The pattern is simple, 5 words interlaced into a perfect palindrome. Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. The instructions are as absurd as they are grand. The square is said to summon prosperity, to conjure sustenance, to draw wealth itself from water. In some versions, one writes the square on fresh parchment and lays it beneath a vessel of water or wine, after which the liquid is said to transmute into nourishment or gold. Mathers, with his characteristic arrogance, claimed it could unlock the secret powers latent in matter. To the credulous, this was alchemy in miniature. To me, it was a laboratory test waiting to happen. My first trial was straightforward. I wrote the square in black ink, folded the paper beneath a glass of water, and left it overnight. In the morning, I tested the water for particles, weighing its residue after evaporation. Nothing. It was water still, pure and dull. No glimmer of gold and no hidden mineral. I repeated the test with wine, reasoning that if transmutation were possible, then it might emerge more readily in a liquid already rich with compounds. Again, nothing. The wine soured slightly, but that was time, not miracle. Unwilling to let it rest, I escalated. I placed the square beneath a crucible, poured in distilled water, and subjected it to flame, whispering the words of the square in the rhythm prescribed. Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. Again and again, until the syllables felt less like words and more like stones rolling in my mouth. When the water boiled away, a faint crystalline residue clung to the bottom. I held it up to the light, my pulse betraying me. The glitter was unmistakable. Gold, I thought. Had the square succeeded? But when I tested it, It was not gold at all. It was a brittle mineral, salt drawn from the air of the crucible itself. Nothing more. The book's promise was false, and yet the moment of wonder, the instant where I believed, unsettled me more than any fraud. For what disturbed me the most was not the failure, but the sound of my own voice repeating the square. Sator arepo tenet opera rotas. Even after I extinguished the flame and scrubbed the crucible clean, the words circled in my mind. They did not leave. That night, I dreamed of walls covered in the letters, spinning like wheels, interlocking, endless. In the morning, I returned to the crucible, expecting to find nothing more than the brittle salt that I had already dismissed, yet, when the light struck the basin, I froze. There, clinging to the blackened curve of metal, was a shimmer unlike the residue of minerals. It caught the sun with a weight and warmth that salt cannot mimic. I pried at it with a blade, and it did not flake away like crystal. It bent, it held, it gleamed with the unmistakable glow of gold. I tested it, certain my eyes had betrayed me. The fragment was soft, malleable under pressure, yielding to the teeth of my instruments in a way that only true gold does. No brittle crumble, no powder. It was metal, real and heavy, a sliver of the very thing promised in the text. I turned the crucible over, shaking it, scraping every edge, and though the fragments were small, no more than specks, it was enough. The square had worked. What I had mocked, what I had called superstition, had left behind proof that mocked me in turn. I stood over the crucible for a long time, my heart clenched in something between triumph and dread. Either the laws of matter had been bent by a grid of letters, or I had lost my reason entirely. Both possibilities were intolerable. The fragments of gold sang in my hand like blasphemy, gleaming proof that the book was not entirely fraud. If one square had yielded substance, then what else might these blocks of letters contain? The absurd prescriptions of angels and asceticism fell away. I no longer cared for their guardians or for their safeguards. I cared only for the squares themselves. I turned the pages feverishly until my eyes found one that promised knowledge of all things past, present, and future. A fool's ambition, yes, but now I was willing to be the fool. The instructions demanded ritual purification, sacred oil, the invocations of the angels, but I ignored them all. I drew the square in thick strokes, set it before me, and whispered the words into the stale air. Dore, orire, rinir, eriro, erod. The first sensation was subtle, a scattering of sparks behind the eyes, like nerves misfiring. I pressed on, chanting the letters again and again until my skull throbbed with their cadence. A sudden heat surged in my temples and blood ran from my nostrils, dark and metallic against the paper. I felt my thoughts split open, not in clarity but in shards, each fragment dragging me toward visions half-formed. Faces, places, voices tangled in a torrent that I could neither commend nor comprehend. Then came the weight. Exhaustion like a leaden curtain dropped upon me, dragging my body into collapse. I remember falling, my cheek striking the table, the square crumbling beneath me. Every muscle slackened, my mind dimming as though the morrow itself had been drained to pay for what I had asked. The promise of all knowledge left me not with revelation, but with the emptiness of a body burned out from within. When I awoke, hours had vanished, and the taste of iron still coated my tongue. The square lay before me, stained with my blood, as if it had claimed its price. The days that followed were not days at all, but intervals of torment. My skull became a drum from some invisible storm. each hour punctuated by thunderclap headaches that split through into static. Light itself betrayed me, stabbing into my eyes with the cruelty of knives. I drifted through migraines that blurred sight and sound, the world around me trembling like glass about to shatter. The nosebleeds returned without warning. I would wake up to find the pillows streaked with red, or to feel the slow warmth crawling over my lips in the middle of reading. My reflection in the mirror became ghastly, nostrils raw, eyes ringed in darkness, skin drawn tight with sleeplessness. Delirium stalked me in waves. At times I could not recall what hour it was or what meal had last passed my lips. Thoughts became disjointed, fragmentary, as if the square had not only drained me but left cracks through which reason leaked. I muttered phrases without meaning, caught myself scrawling letters on scraps of paper, palindromes repeating, interlocking, senseless yet insistent. I had asked for all knowledge, and in return I received not wisdom but its counterfeit, the flicker of insight tangled in pain, the illusion of understanding wrapped in blood and exhaustion. The book had answered, but its answer was a curse. By the fourth day, the storm in my skull began to break. The bleeding slowed, the fevers receded, and though my body trembled with weakness, my mind clawed for more. Reason whispered that I should burn the book, that I should hurl the squares into fire and salt the ashes, yet reason's voice was a frail reed against the roar of desire. I returned to the Book of Abramelin with trembling hands, the pages warped by blood and sweat, the ink seeming darker than before. My thirst for more trials drowned every warning. If a square could produce gold, if it could drag me half dead through the torrents of false omniscience, then what further wonders might these matrices conceal? I no longer sought to disprove them. I sought to exhaust them, to strip them bare and force their secrets into the light, no matter the price exacted. The book waited, its grids of letters pulsing in silence, each one a door half open. I turned the pages slowly, choosing what my next violation would be. I leafed through the squares like a miser counting coins. There were spells to cure fevers, to ensnare love, to bind thieves, to summon storms. Trivialities, I thought, the toys of peasants who longed for shortcuts in their misery. What need had I of charms for petty desires when I already coaxed gold from water and glimpsed the fracture of eternity? No, my eyes lingered on a square that pulsed with greater promise. The square to commune with the dead. Its letters looped like a noose, turning in on themselves with the gravity of a tome. Detir, ireti, timet. Itiri, iritin. The text was maddeningly vague. One was to inscribe the square upon virgin parchment, light a consecrated lamp, and whisper the names of the departed. Purification was again demanded, angelic protection again insisted upon, but I ignored it all. I wrote the letters slowly, each stroke heavier than the last, until the paper seemed to carry its own weight. When I spoke the square aloud, the syllables caught in my throat. Neither Hebrew nor Greek nor Latin, a bastard tongue that made the air taste of iron. The first effect was not sight, but sound. A sharp crack inside my skull, like a spark leaping between wires. And then another, and another. Each one louder until I staggered under the thunder inside my own head. Blood welled in my nostrils again, thick and steady this time, dripping onto the page in globs. I pressed on, whispering the names of the dead as if the syllables themselves were keys. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and every candle guttered as though starved. Shadow swarmed the edges of my vision, and then came the exhaustion, deeper than before. an undertow pulling me down. My limbs quaked, my jaw ached from clenched repetition, my chest heaved as though the act of breathing itself was being taxed. I collapsed across the table, the square sticking to my skin with the glue of blood and sweat. But just before the blackness swallowed me, I heard it. A voice, faint and fractured, not my own, but a wordless murmur rising through the silence of the room. When I woke, the candles had died into rivers of wax, and the room was still. The square lay glued to the table, the paper warped and blood-soaked, its letters blurred as though they had shifted in the night. I peeled it free with trembling hands, half afraid to see what shapes the stains had formed. The voice was still with me, not words exactly, but more like the memory of words, a resonance that clung to the inside of my skull, echoing long after the sound should have faded. It had no language, no accent, no breath behind it. It was the pressure of meaning without syllable, the suggestion of a whisper that had never been spoken aloud. I stumbled through the house, but the silence followed. In every corner I thought I heard a murmur just beneath the audibility. Sometimes it was laughter, thin and dry. Sometimes it was my name. Sometimes it was nothing at all, and only the pounding of my heart. Sleep was no refuge. I dreamt of mouths pressed close to my ear, of lips moving without flesh, of teeth clicking in the dark. Their words slipped like fish through my grasp, fragments of sentences I could not hold. Once, the river. I am still. And then silence. Then another, overlapping, a cacophony of fragments until I woke with my hands clawing at my own face. I have not proven whether I heard the dead. Perhaps it was only my mind tearing itself on the hooks of expectation, but the book had shifted from curiosity to intrusion. Its squares no longer felt like symbols to be tested, it felt like doors half open, and something on the other side had stirred when I called. The book did not leave me after that night. It stalked me. By day I found myself reaching for it without thought, my fingers twitching towards its cracked spine even while my lips mouthed that I should resist. By night it invaded me. I dreamt of deserts, of prophets with cracked lips crying into storms. I dreamt of pillars of smoke and bloodied lambs, of angels with too many eyes peering through torn veils. Every vision was tangled in scripture I had long ago dismissed as myth, yet now it poured through my sleep like oil through cloth. The demons came next. Not the horned caricatures of medieval paintings, but forms closer to absence than presence, shapes half cut from shadow, grinning without mouths. They stood in corners of the dreamscape like judges, silent and waiting, and though they did not touch me, I woke with the taste of ash and the sensation that I had been measured and found wanting. And above all, a god. Not the gentle shepherd sung of by children, but the God of Sinai, the God who split seas and smote nations, the God who burned cities from the earth. His voice was not tender, but thunder. His presence not comfort, but calamity. In the dream he filled the sky with rage, faceless and vast, a storm without end. I woke, gasping, my sheets drenched, my throat raw from prayers I do not remember speaking. Each morning I swore to put the book away, to lock it, burn it. Yet each evening I was at its pages again, tracing the grids with shaking hands. The dreams fed the hunger fed the dreams, and I began to feel as though the book was not merely read, but reading me in turn. The first blackout stole only minutes, or so I believed. I would be reading, tracing the squares with my eyes until they blurred, and then the page would leap forward, hours gone, the candles burned to stubs. At first I told myself it was exhaustion, nothing more, but the intervals grew longer. One evening I sat in the square of flight. When I woke up, the sun was already high. the book open on a different page, letters I did not remember writing scrawled in the margins. Then came the morning of blood. I awoke on the floor, sprawled against the table, my hands sticky and red, the Book of Abramelin pressed tight into my chest as if I had been clutching it in sleep. The stains were fresh, still tacky, and smeared across the cover and the edges of the pages. I searched myself for wounds, but none were there. The blood was not mine. In that moment, I felt it clearly. Another mind, lodged within me like a parasite. Not a voice or hallucination, but a presence, a weight behind my thoughts, a hand steering them. When I moved, I could not be certain that the impulse was mine alone. When I looked at the book, it looked back. The squares no longer felt like tools to be tested, they felt like invitations I had already accepted. Each blackout was a signature, each bloodstain a seal. The line between my will and something else was fraying. I still found myself opening the pages, hungry for the next trial, and my hunger was met with a feast prepared for a god. The book no longer yielded its secrets reluctantly, no longer demanded coaxing or experiment. It opened itself to me, page after page, as though some covenant had been signed in the blackouts and in the blood. Every square leapt from parchment into vision. Letters burned against my eyelids even when I closed them, arranging themselves into wheels, labyrinths, and shapes I could not name. And the feasting began. Knowledge poured into me in jagged torrents, languages I had never studied, formulas that made no sense, faces of the dead grinning with teeth worn to nubs. I heard psalms in 1,000 tongues, each one twisted into mockery. The air grew thick with the scent of rot and frankincense, and the walls of my room wept with damp stains that bled into unfamiliar symbols. My body convulsed against the tide, but the presence inside me drank deep, dragging me further into delirium. I tried to close the book. My hands would not obey. I tried to avert my eyes. The letters clung to me, pulsing like wounds, searing themselves into the fabric of my thoughts. I screamed prayers I had mocked. I cried out to gods I had despised, but every syllable was swallowed before it left my throat. In that moment, I understood. There was no retreat. Whatever threshold I had crossed could not be uncrossed. The Book of Abramelin was not a curiosity, not a fraud to be dissected, not even a forbidden treasury of power. It was a mouth, and I had stepped willingly between its teeth. I was incapable of undoing what I had done. The feast had begun, and I was not the one dining. In the frenzy, when my mind was split between voices and visions, a fragment of a memory surfaced like a drowning man gasping through the waves. The first square, the one of protection. I clawed at it in my thoughts, the letters etched into me from those early fruitless trials. Salom, Lara, Laral, Ralo, Malos. The words tore from my lips, raw and frantic, not with faith but with desperation, and for a moment, everything recoiled. The pounding in my skull dulled, the voices fell back into static, the visions dissolved like smoke, my body slumped against the table, every muscle trembling, sweat pouring as though I had been wrung out. The book lay before me, open but silent, its letters inert on the page. I realized then that the square had not been meaningless. Not entirely. Perhaps it had never been a shield against demons in the sense the faithful intended, but against something else, against the book itself, against the infection it carried. The protection was not in the parchment or the ink, but in the rhythm, in the repetition, in the way it forced my thoughts into a pattern that drowned out the other mind gnawing at me. For the first time in days, I could draw a breath without the taste of blood, hear my own pulse without the cadence of foreign syllables laced through it. I sat in fragile silence, knowing it would not last, clutching the square like a drowning man clings to driftwood. It is this moment of clarity that I write to you. My hand still shakes, my head still throbs, but the square has given me a narrow corridor of silence, and I must use it before it collapses again. The book waits on the table, breathing in its way, patient and hungry. But for now, I am apart from it. For now, I am myself. I do not know how long this respite will last. Minutes, perhaps. Hours, if unfortunate. Already I feel the edges of intrusion pressing against me, the letters whispering in the corners of my vision, the weight of another mind straining to take root once more. If I lose this window, the book will speak again, and I will not be the one who answers. So I write, not as a warning, for I doubt words can dissuade the curious, not as confession, for there is no absolution to be had. I write only because to remain silent would be to let the book tell my story instead. And if it succeeds, then I am nothing but another of its squares, repeating, consuming, vanishing into pattern.